We will now move to the next and final speaker of the day, Professor Ganti Murthy. He is a professor in bioscience and biomedical engineering at Indian Institute of Technology, Indore. Before coming to IIT Indore, he was a tenured full professor at the Biological and Ecological Engineering Department at Oregon State University, USA. His research is broadly focused on sustainable bioprocessing and resilient agroecological systems. He obtained his master's from IIT, PhD in agricultural engineering from University of Illinois, USA. He has a H-index of 34 and 4,000 plus citations. Anyone who is familiar with these terms will understand to gain H-index 34 is a mammoth task. This illustrates that his research works were well cited and has numerous research publications. Professor Ganti Murthy was also appointed as National Coordinator of Indian Knowledge Systems, IKS, a division of Ministry of Education at AICTE in the year 2021. I can still go on, but I have to stop somewhere. So on, we'd like to allow him to speak. I invite Professor Ganti Murthy to stage to take further. Please, sir.
Very humble pranams to all of you, and great to see you all here, and I'm very happy and very honored to be here in front of you, speaking about some of the topics, agriculture, which is very, very close to my heart. And because first and foremost, I'm an ag engineer, graduate through and through. So I'll be talking about agriculture, particularly from a perspective of Bharatiya Krishi Parampara, in this kind of a world where we are talking about GMOs, we are talking about sustainability and all of these things. So if you think about agriculture and trade, these are two very, very important foundations for any society, and particularly so for Indian society, where we had the seasonality of monsoons, and we are one of the countries where we have 45% of our land is arable. That means it is suitable for agriculture. So what that means is we have land, highest proportion of land where we can grow various crops, enormous diversity of crops, and we have been the cradle of civilization because we could always produce more food than what was needed, and that enabled us to do many, many other things. So, and we traded across the oceans and all of these things. And then when you look at all of that, I mean, what happened before independence? At independence, we were about 33 crores, and then there were, because of the colonial, imperialistic colonization of India, we were really deprived of a lot of things. And then one of the things that imperialistic government did was to extract all the resources from our country. And one of the things that, as a consequence of that, was the massive degradation in the capabilities of our countries to produce food. So when you look at the number of famines that occur before and after, during the British period and before that, even during the Mughal invasions and all of those period, and when you compare it to the even 1,000 years ago and all that, you'll see that the frequency of the famines had increased tremendously, especially in the last 300 years, and that really brought our country to the knee down. And when we gained independence, one of the things that our governments did was improve the healthcare, and what that resulted in, because earlier the life expectancy was that in every family, out of 5 or 6 children, there would only 1 or 2 who would survive. If you think about your great-grandfather's generation or their parents, then you would see that there were always about 1 or 2 siblings. And then by the time it came to, for example, even my grandfather, who was born in 1926, so there were only like 3 people in their family, two children, 3 children, something like that. But then what happened after, because many of the children, the infant mortality was so high that children would not survive. So, but then after independence, thankfully our primary healthcare improved, and a lot of invention of antibiotics, a lot of other things also happened around Second World War time. And when we got independence, the life expectancy improved quite a bit, and then the infant mortality decreased. So we would see that, for example, in my father's generation, they were all 8 or 9 siblings. Primarily because all of the children who were born were basically surviving. And then later it came down to, in my generation, it came down to 3, and then 2 or 1 right now. So essentially what happened was there was a huge population boom because of the way that society takes 1 or 2 generations to react. So that in 1950s to 1970s, we had a huge population increase. And because our agriculture was not up to the mark because of all the degradation and exploitation centuries before that. We were really at edge of starvation, and we needed to really survive. And for that, those of you who may be remembering the PL 480 days, where we were waiting for the ships to come and so that the grains would be supplied in the ration shops and all that stuff. So basically to fend off the starvation, we had to go to the Green Revolution, which functioned, which was essentially the chemical synthetic input-based agriculture, which increased the yields, and right around 1970, late 70s and 80s, we basically became self-sufficient in food, and despite the fourfold increase in the population. But there were costs that we paid. Primarily, the first thing was that the soil health degraded completely. There was depletion of soil organic matter. The soil microbiome essentially was all gone, and groundwater was polluted. There is increased use of pesticides, all of these other things that you see there. And that was the cost that we paid. Now, this is where we need to be thinking about what is the Indian perspective, and can we go back to some of those methods to revive and actually make sure that the Indian agriculture thrives, because the food security is the first expression of a independent nation. Because if we cannot be independent on food for our needs, then we can't really call ourselves to be an independent nation. So it's very important. And then the importance of food has been recognized since time immemorial. And then the famous Taittiriya Upanishad, Annam Brahmehiti Vyajanat, Annam Bahukurvita, Tadvratam Tasmad Daya Kayacha Vidhaya Bhakvanam Prapniyat. I mean, all of these basically verses, I mean, I have taken different pieces there. They say Anna is a Parabrahma Swarupa itself. And it basically asks us to produce more food, not just for ourselves, but for basically sharing it with others. That's the kind of mentality that we had. So if you look at the Indian agriculture and what is the development of agriculture in India, I'll talk about three things. I'll talk about historical developments, I'll talk about some of the unique aspects of Indian agriculture, and then some of the texts in Indian agriculture. Those are the three things I wanted to bring out. So there is confirmed archaeological evidence of agriculture in India going back to at least 10,000 years before the present. That is the confirmed archaeological evidence. And then if you go back to the earliest Vedas, Rig Veda, it talks about even there is a entire sukta called Kshetrapati Suktam. And there in one of the fourth mandala, in the 57th mantra, the first time the word Sita occurs. So Sita is the plow share, the pointed end of the plow. And then Bhruguvalli, of course, commands Annam Brahmeheti Vyajanat, Annam na Nindyat, Annam na Parichakshita, Annam Bahukurvita, all of these things. And then there are several verses even in Krishna Yajurveda which talk of agriculture. But when you look at all of these observations, the verses, there are some very interesting things that occur. There is a differentiation between Nivara, which is any variety of rice, Virihi, which is a wild variety of rice, and then Anavaha, which is the normal domesticated varieties of rice. So by the time of Krishna Yajurveda, what we can infer from this is we already knew of domesticated rice, wild rice, and many other types of rice. What this means is domestication of rice probably happened by the time of Yajurveda as well. And then it also talks about different developmental stages of crops. And then says there is, when you seed it, when you plant, the plant comes out, it flowers, seeds come out, all of those things, and then you harvest. And then, very interestingly, there are verses which say that the farmers should go and consult wise men. For what? For things like land preparation, plowing, furrowing, and maintenance of these furrows. These are something that have been found even in very old Harappan cultures as well, the furrow patterns and all that. So it talks about we should consult the wise men. But then so these are all the things, for example, things we can control. We can control how much we furrow, how do we prepare the land. These are all things in our control. But then when you look at things like the grain filling stage of crops, at that point the crop is very, very, very vulnerable to the natural elements like wind, unseasonal rains, all of those things. So there is not much that can be done. So essentially there they say, okay, invoke the divine blessings. So they invoke the blessings of the Surya, Marut Ganas, who are again basically the deities of all the Maruts, winds, and then the Varuna. So there was the understanding of what was controllable and what was not controllable, even in those at that times, which is pretty old. And then what kind of crops did we cultivate? There were essentially 3 tiers of domestication that happened. The earliest ones are basically the wheat and barley, and it goes back to the earliest stages of Harappan civilization and even beyond that. And then came the other millets, ragi. Tuar came essentially from the west is what we think. And then the moong, chana, field pea, linseed, mustard and cotton, they were all domesticated here. And then the rice was domesticated. There is evidence of domestication in India almost at the same time that we claim that it was domesticated in China. Then there was a huge acceleration in the development of Indian agriculture from about 2,500 years ago. And all of these operations like ploughing, furrowing, seeding, cultivation, which is again to irrigation, weeding, and harvesting, different classification of crops, basically all of these things, even at the times of Parashara and basically Chanakya, they show that this was really a well-established system, highly advanced system with involved high level of expertise, which produced surplus amount of food. If you look at it, producing the capability to produce this surplus amount of food is what enables a society to move up in the civilizational scale, right? Because if you think about it, we are in 1900s, about 85 to 90% of US was involved in agriculture. By the time in 2000, less than 1.5% were involved in agriculture. So if you see, if 1.5% can produce the food for everybody, of course there are all these other inputs, but a society where only a few people can produce enough for everybody else will enable others to be free and then work on other things. So all the civilizational aspects that we talk about, development of culture, all of those things are dependent on production of the excess food. And what is that dependent on? It is dependent on making sure that, we have a variety of grains that are suitable for different agrogeological conditions, because India is a diverse country and we need to be aware of the monsoons, the water, pest management, a lot of these things. So if you think about again, the Krishna Ayurveda, the Chamaka Prashna talks about many of these varieties of grains. It talks about Kuyavaha, which are the small grains. Akshuta basically says, maybe we be free from hunger. Vrihi, Yavaha, Mashaha, Tilaha, Mudgaha, Khalvaha, Masuraha, Priyangavaha, Anavaha, Shamakaha. All of these grains essentially shows the very rich diverse agriculture that was there. And so if you think about this, just think about what does this say about the antiquity of the Indian civilization. If we had such a system developed, these systems take at least hundreds of years to perfect. And such a variety of grains implies a civilization that has been in existence for a few thousands of years. So very important to ponder upon the timeline sometimes. And then coming to somewhere around Chanakya, who is more recent for us because we are talking about Vedas and those times then, for which we don't even know how to date. So there is a head of agriculture, Sitadhyaksha. There are basically the cropping patterns are there, the Kedara, Haimana, Graishmika. So there are all these different seasonal crops. And if you see, there are 3 seasons. If you go into the basically the Europe and Western countries there, most of them have maybe 1 or 2 seasons, if at best. I'm not talking about Greece and all these Mediterranean countries, but Northern Europe, that's the best that you can do, maybe 1 crop a year, at best 2. But here we are talking about 3 crops, almost as a norm. And there was also the kind of farm incentives and subsidy to farmers recorded in Chanakya's Arthashastra. It says, if you dig a pond for rainwater harvesting, they will be exempted from taxes for 5 years. So these kind of very structured things were there in place. And then importance of water in all of these was recognized very early. Even in Shatapatha Brahmana, we have very preliminary idea of the hydrologic cycle. Not just this, but there are even in Rig Veda, there are references to what is known as an albino effect. That is very, very important when you are trying to model and understand the monsoons and any rainfall. And rainfall was actually considered Purva Chitti. That means something that you can predict. Very interesting, because many rishis like Kashyapa, Parashara, Gautama, Vatsa, they all had developed different rainfall prediction methods. Some had developed it based on basically the nakshatras, some had developed based on the indicators, and a mixture of all of these things that you can use Pratyaksha Pramana, and you also basically by directly observing the behavior of the plants, animals, and then all of these, where, for example, we know where the crow builds a nest will determine how severe the monsoon is going to be that year. So, for example, I mean, these are all based on practical observations. And then I was talking to a farmer from Rajasthan who was telling me that they could look at the lightning and then predict what was happening about 200 to 250 kilometers away in terms of the rains and all that in Rajasthan. Again, they all had we had regional specific knowledge that was passed on orally, primarily in agriculture. And then perhaps the very first textbook of the world, agriculture was written in India about 2,500 years ago. Very systematic, Krishi Parashara. And there, even today, we buy a 25 rupee Panchangam, and when we are able to predict what the rains, at least that are going to come in July by buying a Panchangam in January. And how do we do it? Basically, they are all dependent on these different Jyotisha planetary positions, the Rajyadipati, Sasyadipati and all that. And we may think, what does that really mean? So, it actually, when they say the Shukra is here and then the Guru is here and all that, it actually correlates to the different oscillations that are there in the Indian monsoons. There is a 3-year oscillation, there is a 5-year oscillation, there is a 12-year oscillation, and a 3-year cycle really corresponds to Shukra, a Venus cycle. If you see the Venus and the Sun together, that means that is one particular cycle. And if they are separate, there are correlations to monsoons you can make. And then there are all kinds of clouds that we talk about. Even Parashara talks about Avarta, Samavarta, Pushkara and Drona. There were methods to basically measure the rainfall. Parashara talks about, Krishi Parashara talks about Adhaka, which is a measure of rainfall. And then it was defined in terms of some very large area, some about 390 square kilometer area. And Chanakya actually talks about a particular vessel that you can make of I think it was 40 centimeters by 13 centimeters in depth, and then you basically collect the rainwater, and based on that you say how many adhakas or dronas it is, and then you can predict how much rainfall has actually measure the rainfall that has fallen. And this was used for various calculations. And Varahamira talks about the Garbhottama, which is essentially how the clouds are formed, how you can look at basically the clouds in Kartika Masa and predict what would happen in the monsoons 6 months later in June, July. And very similar to what we talk about in modern weather forecasting. Nowcasting, short range forecast, medium range and long range forecast. So these are all things that we were very adept at. So this is where we brought in the knowledge of Jyotisha, practical measurements, and then to make sure that our water availability for agriculture is optimized. Why am I talking about water availability? Because this is one thing that is very variable that we cannot control. If I'm in one particular location, I'm stuck with that soil there. But then one thing that I don't know about is this water. And if I have to manage and train, basically align my agriculture to that, that is what is very important to understand when the rains are going to come. So if you think about, I mean, these are all some unique aspects of agriculture that we practiced in India. So if I want to talk about what makes this traditional agriculture unique, one thing, it is essentially what we call a systems approach. The systems approach, basically, the focus was on the interrelationships between the plants, microbes, the soil and the environment. We always took that as a complete system. And the reliance was, so on all the different things follow from that. So the reliance was there on the entire soil mass, not just the soluble nutrients. So when we talk about soil nutrients, nutrients in the soil today, we talk about what we call as available nutrients, which is essentially the soluble part of it. And if you take 1 kilogram of soil, 99.5% of that would be the insoluble part. And we are only dealing with that 0.4%. And when we talk about nutrient management by adding fertilizers and all, we are only talking about that 0.5%. Indian Paramparika Krishi talks about the entire soil, how we can leverage all of that. And then effective utilization of water resources, I just mentioned something about that. And then integrated pest management, seed diversity and varietal protection. How do we protect it? How do we exchange it? Just a small story in that. So there was this Manohar Parikar, the former defense minister, told this, where he was saying that in his village in Goa, there used to be the farmer who grew watermelon. And every year, he would bring the best watermelon from his farm, put it up there, call all the children, ask them to eat. And then only requirement was they can have as much watermelon as they wanted. And this would be the best from his farm. Only requirement was they would have to spit out the seeds in a cup that was placed next to it. All children would come, have fun, eat all the watermelon as much as they would like, and then spit the seeds out. That's it. And then this farmer would collect them and then replant them. And then later the hands changed, and then the son came, and then he said, why should I give the best ones to these kids? Let me give the ones that are not acceptable in the market. And then best ones were exported. The money was good for 1 or 2 years. Slowly, the quality of the watermelons went down in the farm. Why? Because the seed that was being collected was not from the best seeds anymore. So, and then slowly the second best, third best, and then the quality deteriorated over years. Why am I saying this? This is because in our farmers, if you look at them, one of the best things that they would do is share the best seeds among themselves. That is a practice that is even still there. They would share the best seeds among them, and this would actually help in the varietal protection and seed protection. And then the implements that we design, I'll show you some examples of that, were optimized for the input of human and animal energies. So it was not just about reducing the drudgery of the humans, but also the animals that were there. And Professor Bharat showed about the classification of soils. There was also a classification of soils based on the fertility, the color, the climate. Because we are talking about agriculture, so there is all this ecological factors that come into. So there are all these, and then based on the topography, but also revenue. How much of revenue can we get? So these are all different ways in which we classified the soils. And then if we think about the classification that we use now, these are the kind of soils classifications that we use. And so the point of trying to make is we had very good system of classification for the soils. We had very good diversity of the seeds. We knew how to predict the water, and then predict when the rainfall was going to come. We had very good structures to manage the water. And then when we look into some of the agriculture preparations of the land, for example, this is the most energy intensive operation in the agriculture. This one, and in the water, raising the water, irrigation, if you have to raise water. So very different types of plows were used. And they were very different from the ones that were used in Europe and America. And when Britishers saw them, they were basically farmers were tilling only up to 5 to 10 centimeters. That's all. And given the climate that we have, given the kind of soils that we have, that was all that was necessary. And this would also minimize the drudgery for the animals, because if you plow deep, they have to exert more, and it causes exhaustion. And Indians' plows were light. Basically, they were really different. And then the drill plow was a unique Indian invention, much before anybody even thought about in the world. There are basically the history of the drill plow goes at least to 2,500 years recorded. Before that, we don't even know. And they're described in exact technical language in texts of Vriksha Ayurveda like Surapala and Krishi Parashara. So this is, for example, example of a plow from Krishi Shashanam. So you see, it's very similar to the kind of plow that even villagers use even today. And the sharp thing that you see there is essentially to poke the soil, not to hit the animals. In fact, by the way, the ahimsa paramo dharma, that thing actually is coming not in the context of humans, but it actually occurs in Mahabharata's Anushasana Parva, where they are talking about ethical treatment of animals. So, and then this is a plough where this is a seed drill. You can see that this is where they would put the seeds. And then what this was doing was this was opening up the soil, and from the top you would drop the seed. So this would open up the soil, this part. You would drop the seed, and then somebody would stand there, normally a child. And then what that would do is that would close. So essentially you're opening up the soil, dropping the seed and closing it back. And that's how you can get 3 rows of continuous planting. And then this is a more innovation where you see only one hole there, and there are these connecting tubes going down, and that would open up and closes basically, and then this is the one that would actually go in the back, this rope, and then farmer would stand on that. So that would be something that would be closing the soil. And then these are all the different implements used for seeding. So this one is basically a simple flagstaff to see which direction the wind is blowing. And then these are the ones to store the seeds. And these are all different weeding or interculture operation equipment. One of the things that Britishers observed when they came to India was the farmers, Indian farmers, were obsessed with making sure that their farms were free of any weeds. And these were some of the implements that we used. And we know that keeping the farms weed-free is actually quite important, especially if you want to make sure that the productivity is high for the crops. And then basically the agriculture and animal husbandry went hand in hand in India as it was in everywhere else before the introduction of tractors into the agriculture. And when you compare, there is a very good book called Energy Transitions by Vaclav Smil, in which he makes a case where basically he says that bullocks that we they feed on grass, straw, which is a byproduct of agriculture. Whereas if you look at the Belgian horses, which look very muscular and powerful, which will plow the land in the Europe, they required grain to be fed. So they would not survive simply on the straw. So almost 1/3 of the harvest would actually go into feeding these horses. Whereas in India, we would only feed them the straw and some limited amount of oil cake and things like that. So the kind of productivity that we get with the bulls, although they may not be as powerful as a big muscular horse that is 7 feet, it's still that, really much more efficient when you look at it from a systems perspective. And then the field equipment were designed basically to not just to be ergonomically efficient for the humans, but also to reduce the drudgery of the farm animals. And this is that verse that I was talking about, ahimsa paramo dharma tata ahimso paro damaha ahimsa paramam dhanam ahimso paramam tapaha, in the context of the animal basically cruelty, preventing animal cruelty. And then in the Krishi Parashara Maharshi also warns that if you cause hardship to the animals and then try to get more, it will all be lost, because that's not a good thing in the long run. And then Kautilya also prescribes a lot of strict punishments for mistreating animals, not just domesticated, but also the wild animals. In fact, basically hunting animals for fun is a disease introduced by the Mughals and Britishers. We did not hunt for fun in India. We hunted only if the kings were authorized to hunt, only during very particular seasons which did not coincide with the mating seasons of the wild animals, only if they were attacking the villages in their kingdom, not just to go on hunting expeditions and collect trophies. So this was never a trophy thing for us. So wild animals and domesticated animals were all treated in a very good way, ethical way. And then what are the texts? So if you look into agriculture texts, these are all some of the texts that are there, and then I have tried to give you the region and then who the author is and a tentative date. For Krishi Parashara, which is the first agriculture textbook in the world, we know that it was before 4th century BCE, and tentatively we can date it to somewhere around 5th or 6th century BCE, but we don't really know for sure. And then Kashyapiya Krishi Sukta is basically in the Krishna Godavari Delta region by Kashyapa. And then the Vrikshayurveda is a book by Acharya Surapala, written around central and east India about 1000 years ago. Lokopakara is from Karnataka, Vishwavallabha is from Mewar, Udaipur, and then Nuskedar Fanni Falahat is a Persian text commissioned by Dara Sikho in 17th century, and interestingly it also has aspects of Central Asia and Mughal kingdom. And Krishi Gita is a Malayalam text from Kerala, and Upavana Vinoda is a text from 13th century text from Bundelkhand area, and Sarangadhara is the author of that. And Manasollasa is again by Someshwara from 12th century in Karnataka. These are all, again, if you look at different things. So Krishi Parashara, Krishi Kashyapi, Krishi Sukta, Vrikshayurveda and Lokopakara, these are all basically, the first three are for agriculture in general. Now, basically, if you look at Upavana Vinoda, that is horticulture. Manasollasa is about gardens. Nuskedar Fanni Falahit is about agriculture in general. Derives a lot of information from these other texts. Vishwavallabha is again about horticulture, crops, and Lokopakara is again in general a mixture of horticulture, crops, and gardens. So you can see how different texts had different focus areas, and those are the primary texts. And if you look at the secondary agriculture texts, several publications from Asia Agri History Foundation, if you're interested. Dharampalji's collected writings, volume 1, is a very good source of information, that chapter on agriculture technology. And then another book by Professor Subbarayappa on Indian history of science. That is also a pretty good book when you want to look at these. And then Indian Council of Agriculture Research, they commissioned, because a lot of the agriculture knowledge is oral. So what they did was they went on basically across the country, they did a survey and collected a lot of oral traditions, practices that are used in agriculture. And they made an inventory of about 2000 such practices in agriculture in 2 volumes. And then what they did was, for example, like harrowing for soil moisture, they would harrow. Basically, you pull it up with a bullock-drawn harrow, and then after the clods are varied, basically that's essentially something that will help remove the weeds. And then if you want to store pulses, this is something that we do as well. We put some neem leaves. And then if you want to manage nut grass, which is a weed, you have to add goat manure. And this is something that people knew. And these are all the practices that were collected in 2 volumes. And then they validated that in the volume 3, where, so for example, this nut grass management with goat manure would be validated in Karnataka, because it is a practice from Karnataka. So that is what is there in document 3, the 3rd volume. And in the 4th volume, they took this practice and then, for example, implemented it in UP, and then saw whether the same thing would work in UP or Rajasthan or someplace. That was the cross validation. And then they put all the different indications, geographical indicators for different plant species in document 5. And what they have found is more than 85% of the practices that are practiced by farmers and traditional practices are valid, even in the cross-validation studies. And about 10% of them were inconclusive, and 10% were not working, and 5% were inconclusive. So you see, vast majority of those practices still work even today. So, and then what do these texts consist of? I'm just going to give you an example of one text. So for example, Vrikshayurveda, which is one of the more systematized books, because it has a history of about 1500, 2000 years of documentation before that. So it talks about basically salutations to Ganesha, Mangalacharanam. Then it talks about importance of trees, merits and demerits of trees, how, near the residence, how do we propagate, what is the method of planting, nourishment, different elements, both the external and the internal elements for the plants. This is the first book that talks about various diseases for the plant that can be caused by internal factors and external factors, treatments, different horticulture wonders, all of those different things. So for example, in the Kunapa, in the nourishment, they talk about something called Kunapa, which is a foul-smelling liquid fertilizers, one of the first liquid fertilizers made in the world, which can be applied foliarly on the leaves. And then this one essentially is something that is such a pioneering advance in agriculture that you will have to, and then Surapala says it is something that he has inherited. It is not his own invention, he has practiced it. And then talks about different elements, both uses the same framework as Ayurveda, Vata, Pitta, Kapha, Tridosha concept even for the plants as well. And then talks about treatments for different pests and all. For example, you can talk about, it talks about smoking, fumigation. So this is something that was talked about with different mixtures or different, basically things like white mustard, Ramatha, Vidanga, Vacha, Ushana, and different things. And also talks about, for example, if you want to remove termites, you can use the hing, asphodida. Put it in a bag and put it in the irrigation channels, and then that entire channel will be free of termites because they will be repelled. They will not be killed. They will just go away somewhere. So the idea was not to kill pests. It was to let them go away to outside the boundaries of the farm. And why was that so important? It was important because you would plant different, thank you so much, plant different plant species, and that would actually provide the food for the pests as well on the boundaries of the farm. And but when we look at these texts, we have to be a little cautious as well. For example, it talks about two things, like white flowers of a tree turn into golden color if it is watered with mixture of turmeric powder, kimshuka, cotton seed, manjishta and lodra. So, and then there is another one which talks about how you can get pomegranate from banana, this thing by. So you have to be careful when you look at this. Second one is not possible. I mean, it's looks like a more of a Kavi Hrudaya than a real thing happening. But the first one could be possible. We have to test. Earlier, one of the things that is mentioned in this book is also that you have to, you can treat the cotton seeds with some juices of lime, lemon and all those, and you can actually get colored cotton. Now you may wonder, is that possible? Is that scientific mumbo jumbo? But really no, because it is possible because the colored genes are turned off, and basically what you're trying to do with these treatments is introduce epigenetic changes which will switch on the genes that will produce the color in the cotton, which are silenced in the white cotton. So this is something that, in fact, one of the research projects from the IK's division, they're looking at this thing right now to produce colored cotton, because what that will do is you can have fabrics made of various colors. We're not talking about blues and all that, but at least different shades of red, brown, yellow, all of those things can be produced. So, and so I will just talk about few importance of some of the traditional methods, for example. So we have heard about a lot of these things. Maybe some of you have heard about these methods, like do nothing, which is essentially called a Fukuoka method, introduced by Mr. Fukuoka from Japan, and biodynamic agriculture, which is something similar to organic agriculture, but with some things like they will put some cow horn, fill it with cow manure, spread some quads and all of those things. Vermiculture, again developed in US by Appelhoff, and Natu Eco by Dhabolkarji, Rishi Krishi by Deshpande, Agrihotra by Gajanan Maharaj, Panchagavya method, which uses the Panchagavyas along with basically this is the kind of the composition. The Panchagavyas are there. Along with that, there is also the tender coconut water and cane jaggery. You have to basically ferment that for 30 days, and that's essentially the liquid Panchagavya that is used for nourishing the plants. Of course, the Krishi Suktas and Vrikshayurveda that we have, compost tea and bokashi tea by, basically this is a degraded fermentation and steps, bokashi method. So these are all different methods that people have proposed. Of these, when you look at really what is practical on a large scale, the three things that I have highlighted are the ones that can be adopted even by farmers on a big scale, because we need to be thinking about scale when we talk about agriculture. And a lot of this traditional knowledge is unfortunately being lost, but now we need to make sure that we make efforts to preserve that, document it so that it is available, and we can revive the soil health in a way that actually will sustain the agricultural yields for a population of 10 billion that we are going to hit very soon in next 20 years or so. So there are all these different indicators for water sources, suitability of the soil. For example, just by looking at the Negroda tree, you can say that you can produce barley in that soil. Jambu tree, I mean, suitable for black gram, sesame and all that. And different fumigation methods, these are all there. This is a pot irrigation method you might have been aware of. This is very useful for making sure that the plants survive the summers, because the summers surviving during that is really the critical thing for a plant, especially in the first 2 years of their life. And then, for example, I mean, Ayurveda talks about that Kunapa Jala, discarded meat, bones, oil, cake. Is that really mumbo jumbo? Does it work? One of the things that we need to blend in, where we can bring in the methods from the modern science without changing the Bharatiya drishti for the agriculture, is to see how these things work and can we improve and all of those things. So when you look at it, I mean, these are all the different fertilizers that are mentioned and people use them. So we actually did some studies in our lab to basically take some of the wastewater treatment produced algae that looks like this, to use that as a fertilizer after some treatments. So we wanted to shift from the synthetic agriculture, basically which uses synthetic fertilizers, or industrial agriculture, to more of a paramparika krishi, or something that is more sustainable. When you try to do that right now, because the soil microbiome is so degraded, it takes about 3 years for the soil to build up, and that soil health to build up, and soil microbiome to build up. And during that time, there is a 30 to 40% yield loss, which no farmer can afford. So what we had done was, we have wanted to reduce that to 1 season. And we were kind of successful when you look at some of these technical data there, essentially. But what kind of fertilizer that we were producing and what kind of composition that we came up with was very similar to what basically Kunapa Jala talks about. And this was my eye-opening moment when I saw this and went into this much more detailed. And when you look at this traditional agriculture, it all is about how do you take what is known as a systems approach to agriculture. And then biodiversity protection, all the sacred groves that are there in every state really talk about it. And this is something that we have in our ethos, whether you go to Assam with Jadav Paing or Salumarada Timmakkaji from Karnataka, it's something that we really think about. And coming to the last 2 slides, these are the recommendations from the World Scientist Warning to Humanity, a second notice which was given in 2017 after the first notice in 1992. Few of the recommendations there that are relevant to agriculture is to make sure that the nature's ecosystem services are maintained by not converting them to other uses. Reduce the food waste. If there is one thing that we can do to improve, contribute to the environment, it is to make sure that we do not waste food. If we don't waste food, we are protecting the environment in so many ways. And promote the shift to plant-based things. If we can give up meat and if we don't waste food, this will be your greatest contribution to environment. And then basically, obviously, we need to keep the parampara alive, so we need to educate our children about all of these things. And 3 takeaways would be to understand, study, and advance the traditional wisdom. Make sure that we conserve our water resources and don't waste food, and show compassion to all living beings and nurture them, because after all, Isha avasamidam sarvam yatkincha jagatyam jagat tena tyaktena munjidam agruta kasya siddhanam. Namaste.
Yogi Ramsuratkumar, Jai Guru Raya. I invite Dr. Sundaraman sir of Ma Devaki Veda Patasala to facilitate and honor Professor Ganti Murthy.